A good Monday evening to everybody, and welcome to the Brandon Warne poorly produced podcast project coming to you on a Monday night for the very first time. As spent a little time out of town over the weekend, kind of chit chatting with people on Twitter about some Twins stuff and on Facebook too, and that kind of got my mind thinking that maybe it'd be a good idea to record some of my thoughts because kind of the back and forth and the views that I had were kind of getting hard to keep up with, and I'd like to use this podcast as a way for me to limit the amount of tweets I send out. And I realize anybody sitting out there listening to this is probably laughing really hard at that idea because of how much I tweet. But in some ways, I think of my Twitter account kind of as my radio show. It's kind of my platform to the masses where I can talk about one thing and then another and kind of jump back and forth and interact with the people who find me interesting enough to interact with. And I appreciate that. I really do enjoy having everybody interact with me. So anyway, to make a long story longer here on the podcast, I kind of was thinking about what's the best way for the Twins to address the problems that plagued them this entire season. And I've talked with a number of people, and they say, "Oh, offense isn't the problem. Forget about the offense." Well, that's right in some forms and fashions. The Twins were, I think, among the top 10 teams in runs scored, top 10 in weighted on base average, but you can't go into next year thinking the offense is fine if you believe that Brian Dozier could regress, or Kenneth Vargas could regress, or Danny Santana could regress. And you better believe that all those guys could regress. But the same token, Brian Dozier could get better. That's, with his batted ball rates and batted average on balls in play, there's some room for improvement there. But you got to also imagine that Oswaldo Arcia will be better, Joe Mauer will be better. So to say the offense is fine probably is a little bit of a logical fallacy. Just because they were good in 2014 doesn't mean they're going to be good in 2015. There's too many variables at play. Now, that isn't to say that that's something that the Twins need to address actively, because that's definitely not the case, as we've seen the pitching staff, specifically the starters, but I don't want to let the bullpen off the hook either, because the bullpen was pretty bad. People will say, oh, it was fine. Well, if you look at the bullpens in the playoffs right now, maybe it's not a fair barometer because the Giants, the Royals, the Orioles all have some of the greatest bullpens in the game. But you can't get by with just a decent bullpen, let alone a terrible bullpen, as we saw the Tigers get swept out of the series. So anyway, what I want to dig into here after a 3-minute intro, obviously, is what do I think the Twins can do to have a successful off season, but also be reasonable or practical. And so I've been kind of having a back and forth with a bunch of people, primarily Travis Auni, who has podcasted with Seth Stowes in the past. He's living in Texas, I think, right now, or he's been living in Texas, doing some substitute teaching. And he says the Twins need to go get Jon Lester. Now, on the surface, yes, that makes sense. And when you think of the problems that the Twins need to address, starting pitching is 1A with a bullet. Actually, just one, not 1A. One with an asterisk, with a bullet point, with an exclamation point. The Twins need to address pitching. But sometimes the obvious isn't necessarily the best way to address a problem. Now, there are 3 top-tier pitchers that are free agents. There's James Shields, there's Max Scherzer, and there is Jon Lester. Lester is a natural target because there will be no qualifying offer attached to him, so meaning it won't cost a pick to sign Jon Lester. Now, it's going to cost a whole pile of cash. We're talking $25 million a year, upwards of 6 years. I would not be stunned. I've said this on Twitter, and I've discussed this with people. If he got near $200 million, it wouldn't even bat an eye. I wouldn't even bat an eyelash at that, because a guy like him might get 8 years at $25 million. That's $200 million right there. Shields, on the other hand, probably going to get more like 4 years, 5 years at 20-some million. He may get under 100 total. And then I think Scherzer will probably be above and beyond maybe even what Lester gets. It's hard to know exactly. The qualifying offer and what the Tigers will get for that will change things too, but it only takes one team to tango, in the sense that they're going to dance with the player and see what they can get out of that negotiation. Now, yeah, it makes a ton of sense for the Twins to sign an ace. But is it practical? No. It's not even remotely practical when you think about the fact that One of those three guys wants to come play for the Twins. And the guy Travis keeps banging the drum for is Jon Lester, who is fantastic. One of the 5 best starters in the American League this year, maybe one of the 3 best starters. And so, yeah, sort of foundationally, the best way to fix a problem is to bring in somebody really good. But it kind of got my wheels turning, and it kind of got me thinking about other free agents and what might make the most sense for the problem that is unique to the Minnesota Twins and where they're at, not only in the contention curve, but in regards to the personnel they have right now. And where they're at, where they're going to add, who they have in the minor leagues that can come up and help soon. I kind of cooked up what I think might be considered a crazy idea by the Twins brass, maybe by all you fans listening, but hear me out. The Twins need to throw stacks of cash at, and drum roll please, Russell Martin, catcher for the Pittsburgh Pirates. Now, we don't even know if he'll get to free agency. It'd be surprising if he didn't, because he's gotten this far. He's gotten to this point where you may as well hit free agency and see what your value is, especially as a guy who check here, he's going to be 32 at the beginning of next season. He's actually about 2 months older than Joe Mauer. So Martin has really had a coming of age. He had a fantastic season this year. The perfect time for him to have a fantastic season heading into his free agent offseason. He's coming off, I think, a 2-year deal with the Pirates. But what the claims are that Martin has done, and it's easy to see this a couple different ways. The Royals will claim, they'll swear up and down that James Shields is what stabilized that team, that rotation, that presence. And so that's the argument that people are going to have and that they're going to go to for a Jon Lester, a James Shields, a Max Scherzer, that the rest of the team emulates that guy. But foundationally, if you strip it down, the Royals employ the best outfield defense and a staff full of fly ball pitchers. The guys that don't do the fly balls have an infield with Alcides Escobar and Omar Infante and Eric Hosmer. Moustakas, I think, is a pretty good fielder. So, great team defense. That is a huge part of it. And then keep in mind, the bullpen is amazing, and the rest of that rotation doesn't suck. So, is it as much about going and getting James Shields, or is it kind of a correlation causation thing that, oh, hey, suddenly the rest of the team doesn't suck too, and so now we're awesome? To that end, though, maybe that doesn't really address my point that, a pitcher could, in theory, elevate his teammates to a point where the rest of the staff improves. More practically, though, I think you can sign Martin for probably $13 to $15 million a year. And that sounds crazy. I know hearing those words out of my mouth sounds crazy, and he's probably not worth that, but it's probably going to take that to get him to come play for a 90-loss Minnesota Twins team. Foundationally, and this is attacking a problem in a roundabout way, it makes more sense to squeeze surplus value out of pitchers you already have, because you already look at this rotation full of pitchers who the Twins believe in and want to give chances to. Your Trevor Mays, your Tommy Malones, and that's before you even consider the top 3, which is Gibson, Nolasco, and Phil Hughes. Alex Meyer coming up at some point. A wild pitcher like that is going to need a catcher who can frame his stuff. That's where Martin comes into play here. He's one of the best pitch framers in the game. But the Pirates have raved about him and what he's done to basically bring a new foundation to the Pirates. Now, I can hear what you're saying in your head. Well, why are you arguing against Shields doing the same thing that Martin might do? I hear that, and believe me, I understand. But I think a catcher catching every single pitcher has more effect than a pitcher who pitches once every 5 days just talking to his teammates or leading his teammates by example. I think with Martin, not only do you bring in probably a guy who is a 3-win catcher by Fangraphs WAR or more. This year over 5, last year over 4. He's been over 4 and 5 again back when he was with the Dodgers, when he was in his mid-20s, when he was basically vying with Joe Mauer and Brian McCann for the best catcher in the game status. You not only bring in that on a surface level, but you bring in a guy who can elevate the level of the young pitchers you have, and they're going to be bringing up a lot of young pitchers in the near future. I think Martin is the right guy to catch a Trevor May, an Alex Meyer, a Jose Barrios. And that's before you consider what he may be able to do for the veterans you already have on your staff. Now, Martin had a great offensive season. His on-base percentage was over 400. So it's not like you're bringing in a bat who isn't going to change the structure of the lineup. That's the kind of guy, with a 400 on base, you could bat second. You could bat fifth. You could bat wherever and just kind of move some things around. Now, what I understand then is you're basically giving up on Josmiel Pinto. And I've come to a point now where if the Twins really don't think he can catch, maybe that's what you got to do. Maybe you can flip him to Tampa Bay and get Jeremy Hellickson. Get another arm in here. Get another pitcher he's reaching his later arbitration year, so he's not going to be free. That's a big reason why Tampa Bay wants to get rid of him in the first place. So you start adding more arms, and I know what people are saying, there's plenty of arms already. Well, that's where the plan kind of comes in play, where the best five play in the rotation, the losers go to the bullpen. And in that situation, I think you can then get rid of Brian Dunsing, you can get rid of Anthony Swarzak, you can get rid of Jared Burton and say, look, thanks for everything you've done. We'll move on. And you might have Trevor May, Tommy Malone working out of the rotation, or the bullpen. You might have Alex Meyer work out of the bullpen to come up. And that's not necessarily a bad thing either. You'll have a better catcher. You'll have those guys working in short bursts to work on their control. You get the cream rise to the top. And you can have a pretty good rotation next year. Now, you also, for the amount of money that you would spend on Jon Lester, and I'm assuming that is $25 million a year, you can bring in Russell Martin, and you can bring in a second-tier starting pitcher. Now, Russell Martin is going to cost you a draft pick, or he's going to be a type A, because the Pirates aren't dumb, and they'll offer him the qualifying offer. So, are you going to give up a qualifying offer for the other two starters, or the whatever it takes you? I think the Twins pick may be protected. I never know exactly how that works off the top of my head, but if you're going to break that qualifying offer barrier, for me it makes more sense for a catcher. Now, I think, like I was starting to say, Martin costs you $15 million a year. You could bring in a starter for $10 million a year. That's $25 million, which you would have given to Jon Lester. You've not only improved your catching defense, and I get that probably wouldn't sit well with Kurt Suzuki, and I'll address that here before we leave. You can bring in a second-tier starter like a Brandon McCarthy, who in a lot of ways is like Phil Hughes with his stuff. He's a fly ball guy. He's a strikeout guy. He doesn't walk anybody. Bring him in. Give him a good outfield defense with Hicks out there and Schaefer. And just kind of build up with what you have. There's a lot of second-tier guys out there. There's Jason Hamill. There's Francisco Liriano, who will probably also get a qualifying offer from the Pirates. But you don't need to go out and get that number one guy, because they're not really on the cusp of anything great in Minneapolis right now. And so it makes more sense to build that foundation and then let the prospects filter in. And then after 3 years, say you sign Martin for 3 years and $45 million, you can give the keys to Mitch Garver. You can give the keys to Stuart Turner. You can do whatever you want in that front, but you've created that foundation. Now, this does leave an elephant in the room. We got a minute and a half here. Kurt Suzuki. You just signed Kurt Suzuki to a 2-year extension. We saw in the second half, Suzuki's first half was kind of a fluke, and we kind of knew that coming into it, because the guy hasn't hit since he was in college, basically. I mean, he's had a couple decent offensive seasons with Oakland, but nothing crazy. Suzuki's not that foundational catcher. He didn't get a contract. That doesn't mean he couldn't be a backup. And if he wants to explore a trade, you allow that. You offer that. But that doesn't look good when you just sign him to an extension that doesn't start until next year, and I get that. But at the same time, you can't let that get in the way of improving a team and making it better. Martin caught like 110 games this year. You could also use Suzuki there as a backup catcher. He's not making too much money where he couldn't be a backup. I get this is a lot of words and a lot of breathless speculation over something that won't happen. But if the Twins are going to spend money, there's really nowhere else other than maybe a shortstop or maybe an outfielder. So you got to be creative. You got to address a problem in a creative manner. You have to innovate to stay relevant in the game today. Nothing the Twins did this year, with the exception of playing Danny Santana in center field, was innovative. It's time, Minnesota Twins, to innovate and survive. Thanks for listening, and hopefully we'll have another edition of the podcast very soon.